Thank you everyone for coming. Welcome from Village Well Books and Coffee. We're Culver City's newest independent bookstore. We are a cafe and a bookstore, and we have a strong mission to create a community gathering place and a place for people to make connections and find comfort and inspiration. And we're so excited tonight to have our two special guests, Carolyn Campbell, who's going to be talking about her book, and Alex Nee, who's going to be helping her present it to you. So thank you to our special guests, and thank you to everybody who's joining us tonight. Like I said, at the end, we're going to share everybody's video screens if they want, so we can do a Q&A together. Carolyn Campbell's book, City of Immortals, is a first-person account of a legendary cemetery that will delight Francophiles, tourists, and armchair travelers while enriching the experience of Taphophiles, cemetery lovers, and aficionados of art and architecture, mystery and romance. Carolyn's evocative images are complemented by those of renowned landscape photographer Joe Cornish. City of Immortals celebrates the novelty and eccentricity of Père-Lachaise Cemetery throughout the engrossing story of the history of the site established by Napoleonic decree, along with portraits of the last moments of the cultural icons buried within its walls, including Oscar Wilde, Edith Piaf, Gertrude Stein, Frédéric Chopin, and Marcel Proust. So here with Carolyn today is actor Alex Nee, who's going to be acting the part of Jim Morrison. Alex is an actor, musician, and circus performer. After touring the US, UK, Canada, and Japan with the musicals Once and American Idiot for many years, he made his Broadway debut in Jack Thorne's A Christmas Carol, just in time for the pandemic to hit. So thank you again, Carolyn and Alex, for being with us tonight, and we can't wait to hear your presentation and see it.
Great. Thank you. I want to welcome everyone here, and my deepest appreciation to you, Jennifer. I'm thrilled with the opening of Village Well, and I also want to extend my thanks to Joanna Brody for introducing us. No cemetery is more rewarding and historically significant than Père-Lachaise. It's in the far eastern part of Paris, which is the 20th arrondissement. It's one of the most idyllic places, a forest really, with 5,000 trees. In the fall, it's a festival of color with the sounds of songbirds overhead. And in spring, the air is filled with the sweet smell of chestnut blossoms. It's also the largest green space in the city. Though it's a model garden cemetery, its layout is very urban. A 107-acre cityscape with winding streets, pathways, and directional signs. It became a model for cemeteries as a place to stroll, a fusion of nature, sculpture, and memory. It brings to mind a favorite quote by Honoré de Balzac, who is buried there. I seldom go out, but when I feel myself flagging, I go out and cheer myself up in Père-Lachaise. While seeking out the dead, I see only the living. Before we head out on a tour, I want to go back to how I became a passionate Francophile. I have my hometown of Washington, D.C., and beloved Corcoran Gallery of Art to thank. I grew up in Washington and flew my kite under the 500-foot-tall obelisk that is the Washington Monument, and ran alongside the football field length of the reflecting pool in summer times. I didn't know until high school that the city was planned by a Frenchman, Pierre-Charles L'Enfant. He was responsible for the elegant design of the National Mall. With its wide boulevards for strolling and gardens bordered at one end by the Potomac River, it formed the perfect backdrop for great monuments celebrating history and culture. At age 8, I would take the bus west past the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue and turn onto 17th Street to the Corcoran Gallery of Art, where I went to the Saturday's children's art classes. I was in awe of what revered American architect Frank Lloyd Wright called the greatest example of Beaux-Arts architecture in the U.S. Who could have imagined that many years later I was hired as the museum's first director of public relations and special events? I got to create receptions for visiting dignitaries and hold press previews for exhibitions set in the impressive 40-foot tall atrium with its Doric colonnade. It was during a staff meeting at the museum when the conservator, Robert Wiles, who moonlighted as a travel agent, said, "Carolyn, someone in my charter just canceled, and did I want to go to Paris next week? All I had to do was pay the tax." I hurriedly made plans for my first trip to France. That same week, an artist at an exhibition opening heard I was planning to go to Paris. He knew that Oscar Wilde was a literary hero of mine and told me that his ancestor, Sir Jacob Epstein, sculpted the monument marking Wilde's burial place. I had my first destination. And this is where the story begins. On my first visit in 1981, I became enthralled with the cemetery's rich history and artistic significance. I vowed to return as soon as I could, so in 1982, I commissioned a colleague, British photographer Joe Cornish, to join me to create what I envisioned to be a nostalgic photo album of this Elysium of the afterlife. 3 decades later, we are still captivated by its ever-changing beauty and mystery. When I told Joe that we had a book deal, he quipped, "I had hoped we might publish our work about Père-Lachaise before we were buried there." I discovered that Joe and I were not the only ones in love with the cemetery. It is known as the most famous resting place in the world and welcomes 3.5 million people each year. It's the fourth most popular site in Paris after Notre Dame, the Eiffel Tower, and the Arc de Triomphe. However, during the pandemic, it was closed and only briefly allowed funerals. Now, France is open to all vaccinated tourists. So what was the genesis for this cemetery? In the first place, over the centuries, war and the devastation of the plague had already filled the catacombs and church graveyards across Paris, the traditional burial places. There was an incident when a heavy rain caused a major flood and a shared wall of the Cemetery of Innocents and an adjacent building collapsed, spilling thousands of corpses into the homes of the unsuspecting apartment dwellers. 18th century Parisian engineers had overlooked one significant question in their urban design scheme: what to do with the ever-increasing population of the dead. Those apartment residents and many other citizens complained to the young new first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon directed his engineers to solve the problem. Nicolas Frochot, prefect of the Seine, proposed holding a competition to create new cemeteries on the outskirts of the city. The first ever commission of its kind was awarded to architect, landscape, and urban designer Alexander Theodore Brongniart. However, people were not thrilled about a long trek to the countryside for burials or visitation. Plus, the bishops did not like the idea of losing money. But the church had no choice. They had run out of room. Frochot had a keen sense of how to appeal to the masses by creating something intriguing. He convinced Napoleon of a plan to win over all the critics as well as the hesitant clientele by naming the cemetery after Father Lachaise, the Jesuit confessor of the popular Sun King Louis XIV. He launched an inventive real estate promotion, filling the cemetery with sculptures and the remains of the famous and infamous, including Molière and La Fontaine, their tombs here, and the ill-fated 12th century lovers Heloise and Abelard. The grand opening of Père-Lachaise was held on May 21st, 1804. We have the 19th century architects to thank for moving away from the Christian-dominated imagery of a cemetery as macabre sadness and a frightful place filled with dead bodies, to the pantheistic view of a cemetery that reflects a more peaceful concept of a sweet rest. After all, the earliest interpretation of the word cimetière was a place where one sleeps. Etienne Louis Boulet was one of the most admired architects of the period and the mentor of Brongniart. He was a proponent, of the pre-romantic celebration of the divinity in nature. Brongniart carried out this concept in his revolutionary garden-style plan that had stood as a model for cemeteries in the US and Europe, including Highgate Cemetery in London and Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Let's look at the map to get our bearings as we walk through the cemetery. Remember the layout as we start at the very bottom and we work our way up. The 3 tours in my book, which are in a pocket in the back cover, are designated by the color shading. The dark green area to the right in Tour 1 denotes the oldest section that was founded in 1804. Etienne Gaud was served as the chief architect of the city of Paris in the early 1800s. Known for his neoclassical designs, he created the main Boulevard de Ménilmontant entrance to Père-Lachaise, which consists of the elongated horseshoe-shaped driveway with a pair of tall central gates topped by 2 carved medallions. These bear the classic funerary symbols of the torch, representing life's flame, and the winged hourglass, symbolizing the passing of time. As you enter these massive gates and walk up the main aisle, Avenue Principale, passing the graves of writer Colette and Louis Visconti, one of the architects of the Louvre, one encounters the monumental sculpture Aux Morts, to the dead, created by artist Paul Albert Bartholomé. Originally designed as a tribute to his wife, the monument features a mournful procession of men, women, and children marching toward an immense dark doorway into the next life. The site also serves as an ossuary that contains the remains of many thousands of Parisians. When other cemeteries in the city were closed or when people's graves in Père-Lachaise were reclaimed due to negligence or for lack of rent payment, remains were placed in the ossuary. Those are the 2 small doors you see on either side of the sculpture. French architect Hector Guimard designed the only completely Art Nouveau tombs in the cemetery. His atelier's signature appears to the lower right corner near the back of the dove gray marble tomb. Guimard was can we move back to the okay, to the Art Nouveau? Nope, back the other way. Other direction. Nope. Okay, let's we have to go backwards. Here we go. Let's see. To the reverse? No? Okay, let's hold here then for the minute. Okay. Guimard was influenced by Eugene Viollet-le-Duc's ideas about ornamental structures. Guimard is best known for his entrances to the metro stations throughout Paris, including the Père-Lachaise metro station, which has distinctive lettering, arched signage, and curvaceous metalwork on the railings. I recommend when you do come to Père-Lachaise, always walk the 360 degrees around a tomb so that you can either find the signature of the sculptor or the atelier of the architect. One of my favorite areas of the cemetery has a significant landscape history before Brongniart applied his design schemes. As we saw in the images shortly before, the original 16-acre site was the Jesuit retreat of Father Lachaise, previously called Mont Louis. Yes, there are mountains in Paris. Others are Montmartre and Montparnasse. Mont Louis is a 1,000-foot elevation, creates some steep walks while you're in the cemetery. The bucolic site was planted with lemon groves, rose gardens, tree arbors, and many winding paths, ideally suited to the contemplative life of its former inhabitants. It is now called the cemetery's Romantic section, which you see here, which is the original area founded in 1804. It now serves as the resting place for luminaries such as composers Bellini and Cherubini and Chopin. This particular image, oh, no, can we go back? Go back to Chopin. You should be able to just take your arrow and just go backwards. Nope, the other direction. If you've got the arrow on your keyboard, just go to the back on your computer. There you go. Fine. Oops, nope. One more forward. There you go, Chopin. Okay, this was a picture I want to mention the 30 years that we were shooting pictures here. Joe Cornish and I always look forward to going on Halloween because this is All Souls Day, and tombs that are ordinarily kind of maybe unkempt and needing a little tending become beautifully filled with votive lights and garlands of flowers. And this particular shot was taken at dusk, and we've never been able to duplicate the beauty of this particular time of day. Brongniart died in 1813, so many of his grand schemes never made it off the drawing board. including his dream, and now we're ready for the next image, his dream of a monumental pyramid as a focal point in the cemetery. Historians have been fascinated with Egyptian civilization since antiquity. In France, this obsession was highlighted by Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. Obelisks and pyramids, which appeared on buildings all over Europe, became a prominent feature throughout Père-Lachaise. Today, it is a charming mix of structures, with elegantly styled crypts next to oversized mansions of the dead encircled by rows and rows of modest headstones, creating the effect of an enchanted architectural theme park. Okay. Oops, let me just see here. Okay. The architectural designs in Père-Lachaise represent an encyclopedic grouping of many periods. You would have to zigzag to every corner of Paris to find such a comprehensive collection of the city's important sculpture and architecture, reflecting many periods and styles of art and design from early Roman times to the present. Fortunately, the tombs in Père-Lachaise parallel the city's artistic growth and house all these styles. Brochenard's original plan was complemented over the ensuing decades by hundreds of individual tombs created by an impressive roster of designers, sculptors, and architects, many of whom were credited with creating the significant urban plan and public structures throughout Paris. Some of those individuals are interred within the cemetery. Charles Percier, along with his architectural associate Pierre Fontaine, are interred together in the far eastern part of the Romantic section. Their site, marked by a tall stele topped with an urn with the symbol of the Masons incised in a stone panel at its base. They were largely responsible for the popularity of the Empire style of the era. One of the numerous projects Napoleon hired them to design was the grandly arched arcaded stretch of housing on Rue de Rivoli, the second longest street in Paris opposite the Louvre. Considered one of the first theorists of modern architecture, Viollet-le-Duc was a noted scholar, restorer of medieval buildings, central figure in the revival of Gothic style, and the author of a 10-volume history of French architecture. He won the commission with a colleague to restore the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Upon completing the Notre Dame project, Viollet-le-Duc became chief of the Bureau of Historic Monuments for the city of Paris, the same government office that now oversees the city's preservation of cemeteries. He also took commissions for various tombs and monuments, including the ornate mausoleum of the Duc de Morny in Père-Lachaise. Evidence of the architect's vast knowledge of design is displayed in this elaborate creation, a tribute to the language of stone and form through though its many layered finials to me sometimes appeared more like an aging wedding cake. Built in 1984 and designed by Jean-Camille Formigi, the name Columbarium comes from columba, Latin for dove, and originally referred to compartmentalized housing for doves and pigeons. On some days, a plume of smoke spirals up from the chimney, signaling the operation of its crematorium. To have one's ashes placed in the columbarium, one can choose an underground vault or a niche for small urns in the two-tiered loggia, which is placed outdoors. To access burial niches on the upper tier, one uses the ornate stairway. Several cultural icons rest here, including dancer Isadora Duncan and author Richard Wright. Patrons often paired architects with sculptors when commissioning a tomb, and artist David Donge produced some 56 sculptures throughout Père-Lachaise. These include the equestrian monument to General Jacques-Nicolas Gaubert and the bronze bust of the novelist Honoré de Balzac. Sculptor Antoine Etex has numerous examples of his work throughout Paris, including Père-Lachaise. He was commissioned to create the rectangular panel sculptures of peace and resistance on top of either side of the east facade of the Arc de Triomphe. These and other high-profile commissions established his stellar reputation. However, his most famous work is the tomb he designed for fellow artist Theodore Géricault, with the bas-reliefs of the painter's artworks, including the raft of the Medusa on its base. When visiting the cemetery, again, make sure to look for the signatures of the artist, and you will find Atex's name under the bronze pillow where Jericho's left arm rests. Atex also designed the family tomb of Francois Vincent Raspay, who was jailed for his participation in the 1848 revolution. Atex depicts sorrow via the poignant artwork titled Madame Raspay's Farewell to the Jailed Revolutionary. The ghost of Madame Raspay stretches her arm out from beneath her shroud toward a barred window. Léon Vaudoyer was one of the romantic Beaux-Arts architects of the 19th century, and he won the competition with sculptor d'Angers to design the tomb of Napoleon's general Maximilien Sebastian Foy. It's an elegant Greek Doric monument with Foy's standing figure in the center. Foyer was part of the group known in Paris as a company of romantic radicals. Their projects often elicited the disapproval of the conservative Beaux-Arts architects. Controversy followed artists as well as architects, and the American-born sculptor Sir Jacob Epstein caused a stir with his monument to Oscar Wilde. He carved the tomb from a 20-ton monolith extracted from an English quarry. It presented an enormous challenge to the artist, who spent 9 months carving the large stone on site without referring to preliminary smaller models. A nude winged sphinx, the crown on the figure's head, and the hairstyle are reminiscent of the winged Assyrian bulls in the British Museum, which date to 710 to 705 BC. The Wilde sculpture was one of Epstein's earliest commissions, made possible through the patronage of Helen Carew, a member of Wilde's circle. The work received high praise following the press preview, but due to its prominent male parts, was condemned as indecent. Epstein's work on the Strand in London was also criticized due to the highly sensual modeling of the nude figures. The sculpture on Wilde's tomb was at one point covered with a tarp by the French police. It was the last scandal attributed to the revered writer. Many pilgrims come to the cemetery are bearing mementos to leave at the grave sites: flowers, photos, a personal item, letters, even the occasional marijuana joint left here at the grave of Jim Morrison of the Doors. And many times small pebbles. A Jewish tradition signifies having visited a loved one, as seen here on the grave of Gertrude Stein. Beside the tombs of writers, such as Saadai Hedayet, a new tradition has recently sprung up. A small jar filled with pens and pencils, as seen in the lower left corner, both as a symbol for the scribe interred, as well as, I suspect, a ready implement should one want to jot down a thought to leave behind. My own desire to speak directly with the departed is what inspired me to create what is the heart of the book, called The Conversations. I chose 8 cultural icons and asked about their triumphs and failures, as well as any wisdom they wanted to share with those above ground. The eternal staying power and drama of funerary monuments appealed to the artists who contributed to the mesmerizing environment of Père-Lachaise. Their use of funerary symbols, such as draped urns, hourglasses, bats, skulls, and mourning figures, not only echoed the styling of societal tastes, but also delivered on the promise of visceral awe and wonder in the land of the dead. Bats on tombs illustrated the eerie side of eternity. Skeletons and skulls or other death symbols remind the viewer that death is a part of life and unavoidable. Winged figures slowly replace the death's head or soul effigy. These figures are generally considered angels. The word angel comes from the Greek word angelos, which means messenger. The chief duty of an angel was to carry messages from God. Statues of women in the 18th century often represented the 7 virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, faith, hope, and charity, powerful examples of how women are seen to embody some of the deepest qualities of the human condition. In Père-Lachaise, there are a few scantily clad female figures. Sometimes family members, unaware of the sculptural commission, must have been alarmed to arrive at the gravesite to discover a half-naked damsel in apparent erotic rapture rather than in deep mourning. So, at Père-Lachaise, we are confronted with the great paradox of this vast burial ground, which embraces serenity, horror, anguish, and acceptance, the grand sweep of the human experience. Day after day, year after year, the city of immortals awaits its next visitors. Thank you.
As a special part of our author program today, we're featuring one of Carolyn's Conversations with the Immortals from the book, where she talks with the cultural icons residing in the cemetery. This July 3rd marks the 50th anniversary of Jim Morrison's death in Paris and his burial at Père-Lachaise. Carolyn will be talking with Morrison, and actor Alex Nee will be speaking the part of the rock legend.
Great. For those who happen to have their books, we're on page 71. Conversation with James Jim Morrison, Division 6, Tour 1. As a member of the baby boom generation, I personally related to this particular gravesite more than all the others in Père-Lachaise. Jim Morrison personified an era that I was a part of: the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, sexual liberation, pop art, drug culture, and the loss of so many creative icons in the 1960s. Although I never saw the Doors live in concert, I certainly danced to their hit Light My Fire, played by cover bands in nightclubs, and I bought their albums. My conversation with Morrison at his graveside brought up memories that I hadn't connected with in decades. Hello, Jim. I spoke with your friend and Doors keyboard player Ray Manzarek in 1982 when I got back to the U.S. after my first visit to your grave. I was told so many wild anecdotes about your death and burial that I had to find out from a reliable source what really happened.
Was he able to give you the answers you wanted?
He suggested I keep a sense of balance about the sensationalized stories I had heard and would continue to encounter. He was right. More important is what he shared about who you were as an artist.
Ray and I, we met at UCLA in the film department. We were drawn to cinema. It combined all the arts: theater, photography, music, directing, acting, everything.
You two formed the group The Doors, correct? How did you come up with the name?
We took the band's name from Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception. Huxley took it from Blake, who wrote, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite."
I live in West Hollywood, right around the corner from the Santa Monica Boulevard studio where the group recorded. There's a bronze plaque on the Alta Cienega Motel across the street where supposedly you did some of your legendary partying. I'd like to hear from you, Jim, about the intellectual pursuits that counter your Lizard King image. History seems to have missed exploring the man who is behind those extraordinary lyrics.
Primarily, I considered myself a writer, and I read a lot. Greek and Roman classics, French symbolists, German romantics, modern novels by Hemingway and Faulkner, Fitzgerald, and existentialists such as Camus, Sartre, and Genet. However, these interests were overshadowed by my drinking. My friends, my family, and sometimes my fans, unfortunately, were the unintended victims of my alcohol excesses. I see that visitors to my grave leave joints and bottles of booze. I hope they get more out of my message than just that.
For me, there is no doubt of your legacy as a poet and musician. The Doors albums are some of the highest selling in history. The group got a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame and was awarded a Grammy for Lifetime Achievement. Ray Manzarek told me that you were the American Dionysus. You danced the dance of the shaman, the dance of death, preached human possibility. Breaking through to the other side, you danced into madness, but left us a message that you dared to risk living on the edge. But you going over that edge should be a warning to us.
Well, my moving to Paris in 1971 with my longtime girlfriend, Pamela Corson, was to take a break from pressures of fame. I just, I wanted some R&R after our last album.
Your band manager, Bill Siddons, said in an interview that you were being worshipped into a box and you were really victimized by it.
Well, I created a monster that got out of control and it turned on me. Like my alter ego, Steppenwolf, I think Steppenwolf's creator, Herman Hesse, summed it up best. It happened to him, as it does to all. What he strove for with the deepest and most stubborn instinct of his being fell to his lot, but more than is good for men. In the beginning, his dream and his happiness. In the end, it was his bitter fate.
Too many wildly talented people met a similar fate in that abuse-riddled era. At about your age, I found myself staring into the casket of one of my dearest friends who had accidentally overdosed. There were so many unnecessary losses. Ray said he would gladly have traded back decades of time spent doing other things if you could have lived. He said you'd be making music together, poetry, doing theater, and creating films. Didn't we all think we were immortal in our 20s?
Well, I was already having signs of some underlying health issues in Paris. On top of my heavy smoking and drinking, I became easily winded walking up a simple flight of stairs. And only a few days before I died, I had several episodes of severe hiccup and coughing spasms that racked my chest. One night, when Pam was asleep, I snorted far too much heroin from her stash, and from there...
I'm so sorry, but it's what alcoholics and addicts do, Jim. I don't feel we will ever know the exact circumstances of your death in your apartment at 17 Rue Beautreillet, but I don't think it really matters at this point.
Pamela and I loved Paris. I was writing a lot, enjoying the anonymity and hanging out with wonderful people, including old friends like Carolyn Nee, who also studied film at UCLA when I was there. I had almost stopped drinking. After I died, it took 3 days for all the necessary reports to be filed and formalities to be honored before my body could be released for burial and funeral arrangements to be made. There was no autopsy. Everyone came through and supported Pamela in all of this.
Did you leave any requests as far as your service or your tomb?
No. But Pamela and Alain found a place in Père-Lachaise hidden between two tall tombs, which they wanted so as to create privacy. And there was no headstone. I like the fact that I am buried in the same cemetery as Chopin and Balzac.
I was given a description of that day. At 9 a.m., a small van came to pick up your blonde oak coffin for the short drive to the cemetery. Bill, Alain, your personal assistant Robin Wordle, and filmmaker Agnes Varda were at the graveside. The entire ceremony took only 8 minutes.
Bill Siddons and Pamela had designed a tombstone with an inscription and sent money to someone in Paris, but it never was made. When Pamela died 3 years later, her parents asked that her ashes be spread on my grave, but sadly that never happened either. Before 1981, when Croatian sculptor Mladen Mikulin placed a lifelike bust of me on my grave, which helped identify mourners to the site, fans provided bizarre graffiti on surrounding tombs, guiding people to my hard to find plot, but some people weren't happy about that.
Yes, I saw a lot of that firsthand as a last futile attempt to keep down the defacements. Cemetery officials have installed metal barricades to discourage vandalism, and supposedly guard dogs are posted throughout the cemetery to deter after-hour interlopers. An estimated 10,000 people showed up on July 3rd in 2001 for the 30th anniversary of your death and were asked to file by in small groups to keep things from getting out of hand. In 1988, unfortunately, two reckless fans on a motorcycle stole the marble bust. Your family later installed a bronze plaque, which is now mounted on your headstone, words in Greek that translate as true to his own spirit.
I see so many young people coming to visit, and none of them could have been alive when the Doors were performing.
I think they may see you as a symbol, Jim, of their own restlessness. They idolize musicians who have died young and tragically: Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Brian Jones, Kurt Cobain, and Amy Winehouse. There's a collective anxiety in witnessing how frail life is and the malaise of society. When I asked Ray how he would envision an appropriate burial tribute to you, he said, "I would just like to give those young people a clue about Jim was preaching. I only regret that some of Jim's own words were not inscribed on the headstone. I would have liked to have seen his lyric, 'O great one, grant us one more hour to perform our art and to perfect our dreams.'" Thank you, Jim.
Cheers.
So, Carolyn, I have a question. So I first learned of this cemetery when a friend I met a couple years ago was sending me pictures just for inspiration one day. And I said, where did these beautiful, dramatic, emotional statues, where are they? I'd never seen statues like this before. And I just, I looked them up and I looked at a lot of them and was so inspired. And but I have to say, I've never seen statues like this anywhere else either. So can you talk a little bit about the history of this kind of dramatic statuary? It's so human in such like an emotional way.
I think that this was, really the height of the Romantic era in Europe, and certainly Paris was the pinnacle. And when the wonderful advantage and kind of like the competitive nature of Paris at that time, that the wealthy would try to outcommission each other to get the top architect or the top sculptor to create something literally monumental. You'll will see other. I think there's a beautiful cemetery in Genoa, Stagliona, which is on my bucket list. Which, if you can imagine, the Italian sculptors of the era were just as breathtakingly talented as the French. So it was really unique to the Romantic era. And I regret probably there aren't the artisans practicing today, and it would be wildly expensive to recreate something today. But I urge people, there are wonderful sculptures of all periods throughout the United States. Again, Père-Lachaise is pretty much the granddaddy of all graveyards. So,
all right, Carolyn, we have two related questions. One is that as an American, Jim Morris as an American, how was he allowed to be buried in a French cemetery? And part two of that question is, are you planning on being buried in Père-Lachaise?
Well, as Joe and I quipped, if we always thought as we're walking in some really treacherous places in the cemetery in the winter, a lot of the times it's very slippery. And I said, what if I fall and crack my head open on a tomb? Well, that would have qualified me, because you either need to be born in Paris or died in Paris to qualify to be buried there. And another qualification is if your family already has an established crypt, you are allowed access. There is, however, a waiting list, so that many people have to wait until there is an available plot. As I mentioned earlier, that sometimes people are disinterred because they didn't pay the rent. There's different levels. You can buy a plot for eternity. as Jim Morrison's family arranged for his plot, or 10 or 20 years. And after that time, if the family doesn't arrive to extend it, the person is disinterred, their remains are put in the ossuary, and this plot is available to whoever's on the waiting list. So that's the qualification.
We have a question about your process for your research.
Oh boy, do we have a whole nother hour? Initially, I wanted Joe to take the photographs and I would do the writing. And I started out in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. I became very close with the director of the cemetery. I had a friend there. I'm not fluent in French, and thank goodness for the interns and the people that really supported me over the years. Helped me to have interviews with people. I met the president of the Bureau of French Cemeteries, Paul Bro, and many. I mean, again, in the book, I think it's a 3-page acknowledgments of the people, both at the French Embassy in Washington, D.C., which made the initial diplomatic introductions, to my mother's boyfriend, who was French Canadian, and he translated the diaries of Eugene, Delaqua, and Jericho. So I was able to find out the history behind their friendship, why they decided to be buried in Père-Lachaise. It's just fascinating about the groupings that you'll see. A lot of painters together, writers. And I'm still, to this day, I was on a lecture a couple of weeks ago, and someone asked, who was the first person buried there? And a friend of mine in Paris had told me, and it was a young 5-year-old girl called Adelaide. And so, I mean, it's endless, the anecdotes that one can find. And I tried to, it's a 200-page book, and I tried to really kind of spotlight some of the key historic factors, but I don't think I'll ever end my research. I'm now studying the scientists there because Caltech has asked me to speak about the scientists buried there in this fall. So it never stops. Thank you.
James Williamson, sorry, we're trying to unmute you, but post your.
Thank you.
Oh, there you go. There.
Can you hear me okay? I guess you can. Thanks. Well, for me, Père-Lachaise is most famous for where the communards of the Paris Commune in 1871 made their last stand in a corner of the cemetery. As you probably know, this is the 150th anniversary of those events, which culminated in late May with us people in the corner of the cemetery and then being executed, something on the order of 140 people. And there is the famous Mur des Fédérés. They were called the Fédérés for various reasons. So there was a huge commemoration in the cemetery just a few weeks ago of this anniversary. So could you talk about this portion of the cemetery, the Mur des Fédérés, the marker that's in the wall there, and some of the various graves in that area grouped in ways similar to what you've described for other portions of the cemetery. So thank you, and thanks for your presentation.
Oh, you're welcome, James, and thanks for pointing that out. I chose to focus on, and then I could have gone endlessly. There are hundreds of luminaries from the cultural arena in Père-Lachaise. I focused on 84 of the artists, writers, and musicians, but I did choose to focus highlight the Communards Wall, the Holocaust area, some of the other significant places. And on the map, and of those of you who purchased the book, I'm probably going to wipe out my face with this. In Division 97, there is this, the Holocaust Memorials. There's also Paul Eluard, the poet. Again, there are entire sections that are incredibly moving, both by their simplicity. The Communards Wall is just a very plain plaque, but literally everyone was buried where they died, right there against the wall. And as James said, there was over 120 some odd communards there. And again, the Holocaust memorials are some really moving sculptures. There's probably about, maybe a dozen of them in that curve. It's quite a beautiful, again, the landscaping is phenomenal, and it's very well maintained by the caretakers at Père-Lachaise. So again, there probably are many other things that I wished I could have included in the book, but my publisher said 200 pages, Carolyn, and 100 images. So for those who are well aware of publishing limitations, that was my focus.
Thank you. If I could just add one little detail, right near the Mur des Fédérés is the gravesite of a daughter of Karl Marx, Jenny Marx, who was married to Paul Lafargue, who was a survivor of the Paris Commune, who then fled to London and married, or I don't know if they were officially married, but lived with, I think, Jenny Marx, and they're buried right near the location of the Mur des Fédérés, among Paul Eluard, you mentioned, and some others.
Right. If you go to the front office, sometimes the guards at the gate, they have a small Xerox map. And if you have enough courage to really kind of seek out all of the individuals, they will highlight some of the generals and the French presidents. However, they're not detailed like my map. There's that's very small, and it has like maybe 300 graves, and they're only designated by a little dot. And I was very encouraged when I saw that originally. I said, oh, fantastic, I'm going to find Jim Morrison. Well, Jim Morrison's tomb was very low. It was surrounded by tall crypts. And that is mostly the case. Edith Piaf and Modigliani, they're surrounded by about 30 to 40 low monuments. So again, it's an adventure. I find getting lost in Père-Lachaise just as much fun as finding your destination. So,
did you mention Marcel Proust?
Oh, in the book, yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Again, you can go on my website, cityofimmortals.com, and you'll find the full list of everyone that I've listed in the book, as well as there's a GPS app for Android and iPhones that complement the tour in the book.
Okay.
Great,
Thank you.
James.
Carolyn, we have somebody who's watching who has a relative buried there. Eugene Delaqua is the relative who's buried there. No, Michelle, do you want to speak about that? Oops.
Hi. Wait, sorry. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
No, my great, well, yeah, he's like a fifth cousin or something, but my grandmother's maiden name was Delacroix, and so basically, yeah, that was our relative. And so my first trip to Paris, that was my first destination, had to be Père-Lachaise to bring a flower to the relative. But anyway, so but I loved Père-Lachaise. It was great, and I loved your presentation, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Eugene Delacroix's tomb is his housekeeper, pretty much, I think his assistant is buried right next to his tomb in a very modest, low marker. He's also very close to Balzac. There's a little cluster in that whole area in the kind of the northwest section, but how extraordinary that you're related to Eugene Delacroix. I mean,
yeah,
that is pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, thank you. I just saw his first exhibit at the Met. I guess it was his really the largest exhibit so far. So it's nice that finally people are getting to know him in the United States.
I think that was the traveling show that I saw at the Louvre. It's breathtaking. It's anyone who's in, go see it. It's all his drawings, his journals. It's phenomenal. Anybody else?
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
People can be sprinkled in the Jardin de Souvenirs.
Yes, indeed. I know that that's Sierra Pecheur, who is also very helpful. She went and took my map and helped me to create the satellite coordinates for the app. And her aunt was buried there, and I
Sprinkled.
Pardon me?
It was sprinkled there.
It was sprinkled. It's the Garden of Memories. It's kind of the economical way to you can be had your remains taken from the crematorium, and your ashes can be spread in this beautiful long garden. And it's quite lovely because your remains act as compost to the roses that are always planted there. So we kind of, thank you, Sierra.
Quick question.
Wonderful event, Carolyn and Jim Morrison. It was really, really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
James, did you have another question?
I don't know if you said, I sort of missed some of the Jim Morrison colloquy and performance, but how is it that Jim Morrison ended up getting, I know that there's this wait list, and he died in Paris, but did he sort of jump the queue, or how did that happen?
Well, back in the period, there wasn't a waiting list back then. There really, again, I think it's kind of fairly current in maybe the last 20 to 30 years that there's really been a high demand to be in Père-Lachaise. And again, he had lived there for almost a year. And also he had the connections of Agnes Varda, who was the obviously well-known documentary filmmaker.
Yeah, I
And
met her once.
yeah,
Amazing woman. Agnes, yeah.
she had befriended Jim. As a matter of fact, he had a small kind of cameo in one of her films, and she was instrumental in keeping things quiet. They basically said that this was a young American alcoholic writer. They didn't even, and his name was Douglas Morrison. So no one had any idea that this was Jim Morrison until they were right up until they had to sign the burial certificates that they put Jim Morrison on that documentation. But again, it wasn't a difficult thing then. As a matter of fact, Pamela Curson bought a double plot so that she could have been buried there had her family allowed her to be. So, but there was no headstone. It was just a mound of earth. There was nothing there initially, but he qualified because he died there and he was living there.
We have
Well,
a
thank you. That was a great story.
Thank you.
for Alex. So Alex, how did you come to play Jim Morrison? Because we're assuming that you were not alive when he was, unless you have a very good plastic surgeon.
Oh, no. No, I just got asked through a mutual friend of Carolyn and mine, and someone I'd worked with on a production of Cabaret, the musical. And I'd never played Jim Morrison before, but they thought that I had the vibe. So.
And what did you do to prepare for it?
Well, I've been a big Doors fan since I was like 10. I mean, yeah, I'm obviously not contemporary to them, but it was one of my early music influences. And and then specifically for this production or book reading, I just brushed up watching interviews I could with him and live performances, just sort of trying to get a sense of his spirit, you know. And then I had the text that Carolyn provided, and yeah, that's it.
Yeah, a shout out to Brad Griffith who recommended Jim.
Yes, Brad Griffith is the mutual friend.
Yeah, wonderful LA actor.
LA actor. Center Theater Group. He's some administrator for them, so good guy. Anyways, I was happy to do it, so thanks for letting me read.
There's another question. Do most tombs get decorated for All Souls Day?
I would say the majority, if their families are residing in Paris, yes. And I think I've made probably about a dozen trips to Paris over the years. Only once did I go in the springtime just to get a feel for the flowers and everything. But most of the time I would gear towards the end of October, early November to be there for All Souls Day. And ordinarily everything is pretty, again, it's a forest and the leaves, and it's all of the marble gets, lichen and things growing, mold and all kinds of things growing on it. And slowly you see these parades of family members coming with a bucket of water, some marble wax and all of that stuff. And everything is just pristine. Chopin is like, there are major things like Edith Piaf's tomb and Chopin. The Chopin Society comes, and there's the French tricolor bunting is wrapped around his sculptures, and the votive lights, as you saw in the Chopin photograph of Jim Morrison. So the entire cemetery becomes just this festival of color and emotion, because again, this is the time when you come to pay tribute to your friends and family that have departed. So if you're planning a trip, it's cold and it's rainy at that time of year, but it's really the most beautiful time to see the cemetery. Again, fall colors with the trees, and the fact that in the spring the foliage is so thick you sometimes can't see all of the tombs, but in the fall, because the trees have dropped their leaves, it's quite an evocative scene with bare branches and so forth.
So we know that Saturday is the 50th anniversary of Jim Morrison's death, and that thousands of people go to visit. Any idea how many thousands of people will be there on Saturday?
Well, now that the COVID restrictions are lifted, I have several friends. Many of you may know Michael Kirkfeld. He's there in Paris, and I've asked him to report back. A friend of mine, Thierry Leroy, runs a tour company called Necro-Romantics, and he is giving a tour of all of the places that Morrison visited, the restaurants, the bookstores, all of his favorite haunts, quote unquote, and with culminating at the gravesite. But I suspect it may well be something that the police will have to monitor, because on that 30th anniversary, there was a line. I mean, it's quite a distance from Morrison's grave in Division 6 to the front entrance. And there was a line all the way out to the street on Boulevard Menilmontant, and they would let people come in groups, because people from Germany and Belgium and everyone can travel into Paris. I believe you do need to be vaccinated and be able to prove it. The mask regulations, I think outdoors, have been lifted. I would say that minimally there would be 10,000 people. And throughout that weekend, this weekend, it will be like that. So I suspect it'll be pretty busy.
And Carolyn, one more question. Is this your first book, and what drew you to this subject? I guess that's two questions.
Well, yes, this is my first book. Again, I didn't know that it was going to. Of course, everyone dreams, a photographer dreams, let me do a big coffee table book, right? And, the Taschen or a big publisher would do. But as I spent more time, it became more of a kind of a commitment to the research. I had not found a book that had really paid tribute to specifically the history of the architecture and sculpture in Père-Lachaise. I felt that was the big missed opportunity that people weren't taking advantage of, that when you're walking through the cemetery, it really is a museum of design. Because during, when Baron van Halsman did a big urban renewal and he broadened the boulevards, and a lot of the architecture was lost. There's still plenty in Paris, but if you really wanted to see the leading examples of sculpture and architecture of the 18th and 19th century, Père-Lachaise is the place. So I wanted to write from that vantage point. My own history and study in art and architecture came to the fore. And then, of course, when I realized it's so difficult to find, if you come there with limited time and you're trying to find, Modigliani, well, for one, Oscar Wilde, who was my goal, I never found him the first trip. I was so engulfed in that whole romantic area, and he's up in the far northern section of the cemetery. And Modigliani, it took me 2 or 3 trips, because he was in a low, flat tomb, very nondescript. All I knew, he was catty corner from Edith Piaf. So the map came first. I created, was drawing the map. And over the years, I found a friend who was a cartographer at UCLA when I worked there, and we worked on the design. And I was seated at Michael Webb, who's an architecture writer in Los Angeles, was interviewing me for a design magazine about the map. And he said, "You have all these great photos and all this background. Why don't you do a book?" And I said, "Well, your lips to God's ears. I would get a book." And he said, "Well, let me introduce you to my publisher." And that was Gordon Goff of Oro Editions. And he has an imprint called Goff Books. And he said, "I'd like to make a beautiful book for you." So it was all pretty much serendipity. I was just kind of following, a trail of things that I felt would be helpful to people who were visiting there. So that's how it came about. And it took time because he wanted to mean I had only 2 of the conversations written and he wanted 8. So he gave me 3 months to finish the book. I did a quick trip back to Paris. Joe joined me. He lives outside of London. And we shot a last round of images. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. And as Jennifer knows, when the pandemic hits, everything stops. So I'm really glad that both of us have been able to reemerge now that things have kind of opened up. But
And
I wanted to mention something that I just pasted into the chat is that on Saturday, November 6th, it's a ways down the road, the Theater Raymond Cabaz, which is part of the Lycée Français, is going to produce a festival of Père-Lachaise, an all-day festival, which will be readings and dance and music and a photography exhibition. So I've pasted in the chat the link to the event, and they'll be posting more details over the summer. But mark your calendars. We'd love to see you there. They have a beautiful 220-seat theater there. It's on Pico Boulevard at Beverly Glen. So, and Village Well Books will be handling the book sales there. So, if you have relatives that are going to be in town in the fall, bring them. Come join us.
And if you have anybody who loves France or loves art or is interested in cemeteries or celebrities, this is really a beautiful book to give them. And it would have been great if you had made a coffee table book that we could see these beautiful photos bigger, but I love the fact that this is compact enough to throw into a suitcase. And the next time I go to Paris, I'm definitely going to bring it with me because I can't wait to go and spend an entire day in the cemetery and explore the landscape architecture and the landscape and visit these graves and look at the statuary and read the stories alongside it. It's really an amazing experience.
Give yourself a couple of hours. It's torture if you only have an hour because it's really it's tough. So I mean, I've spent days. I usually go there for a minimum of 2 weeks every visit, just so I can absorb. And I'm still discovering more details every time I go.
Yeah.
So.
A Village Well Paris tour. That sounds like a great idea, Vicki.
Vicki, we're in.
Yeah.
We're all in.
Get in touch. Let's have coffee and start planning.
Yes.
So I just want to thank you guys again, Carolyn and Alex, for being here with us tonight. It's really such a pleasure. We're looking forward to a couple more events we've got on the calendar coming up. Next week on Thursday night, the 8th.
Yeah, one week from tonight.
Culver City native Judy Scott is going to talk to us about her book, Leonard, Mariana, and Me, about her time in Greece as a young 20-something, befriending Leonard Cohen and his muse, and then former girlfriend Mariana Elen. And it's just a beautiful book that's part travelogue, part coming of age story, and part, a celebrity memoir, her encounters with these people in very close relationships. And it's going to be lovely. It's going to be here in the store. We're going to be serving some Greek wine and appetizers, and we look forward to seeing, many of you there. Beyond that, we've got a conversation with Judy Thomas coming up sometimes later this summer. She was born in Hungary and at the age of 5 was left behind when her parents defected out of Hungary for the West. Her father was a Holocaust survivor and just couldn't stand staying in Hungary, but the only way they could get out of the country was to leave her behind and prove to the government that they weren't defecting. And so the story's about everything that happened to her as a child, and we're going to have her interviewed by youth
Seagal of the Venda Museum, which is a Cold War museum that's about 2 blocks down the street from Village Well in Culver City also.
Yeah, so it's going to be a great conversation, and we hope to bring in people who are interested in Hungary and interested in the Cold War and just interested in a lovely memoir. In the fall, in November, we'll have Father Greg Boyle here talking about his new book, and we're planning other events. If anybody has ideas for us of author conversations you want to bring to us, we are open. And we are looking to have this place be as activated as we can. So I want to also thank Joanna Brody, my PR magician, who has really put us on the map and helped us get to know Culver City, and get this store is packed with people on a day-to-day basis thanks to her. So and she put this conversation together and many others that we do. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and just because I'm your PR person,
Yeah.
the next week's event is also going to be live broadcast if you can't make it into the store. So all the details are on the villagewell.com website.
Yep. And if you're not signed up already, get signed up on our website for our mailing list, and you will learn about all these opportunities.
Okay.
Thank you. That was extraordinary.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Good night.